So, John McHugh was elected as a Republican to the state Senate in New York State. And then in 1992, he was elected to the United States Congress, served in a variety of capacities, but ultimately he became the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. And ranking member means that he was the senior most member of the minority on that committee. Served as I served with him there, as well as Jim, and was very, very well respected. So much so that President Obama in 2009 asked him to be the Secretary of the Army, where he served until 2015, being the second longest serving Secretary of the Army. And I will note, John, that I was talking with Ray about that, and I said, wasn't John the second longest serving Secretary of the Army? He said, yeah. But remember, the Army, Secretary of the Army wasn't created until 1947, where the Secretary of the Navy was created in 1794. So he just had a little bit of the edge, I want you to know.
Oh, I do it. You told me all the time.
After that, John then came to work with us at K&L Gates, and now he has his own consulting firm. So John, thanks for joining us. Ray Mabus grew up in Mississippi, went on to be a Harvard-educated lawyer, but felt the call to go back home, where he worked in the administration of Governor Winter, and then later became elected statewide as a state auditor. And then he was elected the youngest governor in Mississippi's history. I will point out, I used to be the youngest at a lot of stuff too, but that was a long time ago. And then his friend and fellow governor, a little bit later, appointed Ray as the Secretary of the Navy, where he started in 2009, and then he retired due to the election of Donald J. Trump, or Ray would still probably be there, but I guess you went out on the last day you could, which was January 1st of...
January 20th.
January 20th. Oh, it was the very last. So you gave him the keys then on the way out in 2016, so, or 17. So thank you both for being here. So Ray, why don't you start off and paint for us your vision of the Pentagon and 10 years out and beyond.
Okay. Well, first, thanks, Bart, and thank y'all for being here. That daughter of Bart's and my daughter became very close friends. Bart's daughter, Peyton, is now at Dartmouth. My daughter, Kate, is at the University of Chicago, and they still keep in very close touch. And for that, I will always be eternally grateful to Bart Gordon. The only thing I would point out about John McHugh.
Why do you have to point out anything?
Is that
you get to go second, John.
during my time, we were 6-0 against Army.
How's that going now?
They haven't won since I left. What can I say?
It's all you.
So when Bart asked me, and when we were talking about how to discuss the Pentagon of the future, one of the things that I brought up was that we at the Pentagon, at least while John McHugh and I were there, and previous to that, had something called the Quadrennial Defense Review, which had the same purpose. You were supposed to look out 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. What were the threats going to be? What sort of things in terms of personnel, in terms of weapons, in terms of everything were you going to need to meet those threats? And every single time we did a Quadrennial Defense Review, which was the year after a presidential election, every single time they were wrong, because you just can't look out. I mean, if you had done a QDR in 1989, right before the wall came down, you would have had a completely different threat scenario. If you'd have done one on September 10th, 2001, completely different threat scenario. We did one in 2013. ISIS did not exist at that time. And so I thought that the way we should look at this is what are the trends that are out there that we've got to pay attention to. And so the things that I think the Pentagon is going to have to deal with over the next 5, 10 years and beyond are things like cyber and the new area of warfare in cyber. It's things like research and development on hypersonic weapons and lasers and rail guns and things like this. It's climate change. I put that at the very top of the threats that we face in national security, that you're going to have to deal with it as a military. The most visible way is our bases. If we don't do something about sea level rise very soon, the largest naval base in the world, Norfolk, Virginia, will go underwater. Offutt Air Force Base in the middle of Nebraska has already been shut down for a good while because of a very intense rainstorm. The Air Force bases in Florida, damaged by hurricanes, Marine Base, Camp Pendleton, more than $3 billion the last hurricane damage. But beyond that, when storms and droughts and floods get more intense, when they get more frequent, the American military are the world's first responders. And so you're putting our troops' lives at risk if we don't address climate change, because where you have these droughts, these floods, these storms, a lot of times uncertainty follows. Sometimes chaos comes out of that, and a lot of times conflict comes out of the chaos. If you just want to look at something today that climate change is causing, is the large migrations of people fleeing places that they can't live anymore because they don't have enough fresh water or because they can't eat. And so climate change, cyber, things like that R&D are the topics that they're going to have to deal with regardless of what the threat is, regardless of who comes over the horizon, regardless of what threats rise and fall over the next 5 to 10 years. And some of the things internally that the Pentagon is going to have to deal with. We were talking about it right before this. Procurement. It takes forever for us to procure something. And usually, by the time we get it, the technology is so out of date that it's almost unusable. I know John did this and I did this. We tried to work around the procurement rules. We developed a new weapon system for our carriers. I put it on the first one as a test case. We have 11 carriers. We now have 11 test cases of that weapon. Because if you had gone through the procurement process, we wouldn't have had that weapon for 6 or 7 years. And so we've got to reform that. We've got to have enough transparency to have accountability, because where there's money involved, there's always going to be the chances for hijinks, for something going wrong. But you've got to allow our military to become more nimble. The world is becoming smaller, faster, cheaper, except for the U.S. military, which is becoming larger, slower, and more expensive. That's got to change. And the final thing internally that I think the Pentagon needs to change, it was a cause of immense frustration to me. John and I have had these talks, but it's the $1 out of every 5 of our defense budget goes to essentially overhead. It goes to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. It does not go to the warfighters. It does not go to Navy, Marines, Army, Air Force. And some examples that I will give. Because usually, if you have an organization and you consolidate functions, it should result in efficiencies. Pentagon is just too big. The Navy has 900,000 people and $170 to $180 billion budget. The Army has more people, a little bit smaller budget. They're so big that they have all the things that you need, all the admin things that you need, but then there's another layer on top of that. That's the Pentagon-wide. If you want to kill something in the Pentagon, do one of two things. Say, we need to do this Pentagon-wide, or we need to study it. And either way, it's dead. The example I will give, and then I'll turn it over to John, is there's a thing called DFAS, Defense Finance and Accounting Service. All they do is write the checks for the services. That's it. The money is appropriated from Congress to the services. And then we send the money to DFAS along with, here's who we owe. Here are our contracts, here are our people. And they write the checks. The last year I was there, they charged the Navy $300 million to write the checks. And we couldn't get a clean audit because 9 out of 10 of their internal controls did not work. Some of the people in this room are old enough to remember balancing your checkbook. You remember when you get down to the end and there was 35 cents you just couldn't find, so you put a correcting entry of 35 cents. DFAS puts correcting entries in every month, sometime for more than $1 billion. They just can't find it. They just don't know what happened to it. And so if you're looking at reform, if you're looking at saving some money, cut the overhead. Cut that sort of stuff. I don't think there's a lot of fraud going on with the Pentagon. I think that most of the suppliers, most of the people that we buy things from are very straight up with it. But there's a lot of waste. And so I think the Pentagon's got to look at the threats that are posed by some of these big muscle movements, cyber, climate change, and space, things like that. But they've also got to look internally to become a more nimble organization. Because our military works well in spite of a lot of the things we do, not because of it.
Bart?
John?
I want to defer. Well, first of all, let me add my thanks to my dear friend and former colleague, Ray Mabus, to the Association of Former Members of Congress. Also, of course, to my former colleague twice now, once in Congress and once at K&L Gates, Ray Mabus. And it's great to see another former colleague, Jim Moran, who was also my congressman for a while. And I'm a Republican, but Jim, I voted for you. I want you to remember that. I know that put you over the top all those years.
Thank you,
But most of all, of course, to all of you for showing up. As we were talking before, obviously you've not heard Ray and me speak before, and you probably would be off doing other things, but we're very, very appreciative of it. So we want to spend more time speaking with you than talking at you, but Ray and I are both recovering politicians. Something that we uniquely held in the Pentagon bureaucracy during our shared time together, and it often put us in very different places than everybody else, from Secretary of Defense on down. But more often than not, I think our political instincts were pretty good and we were right. Let me just talk a little bit about the historical perspective of kind of foreseeing the future and what that means for today and beyond. You know, Ray mentioned some things that we just didn't see, and the list goes on and on. I think Don Rumsfeld, former Secretary of Defense, kind of summed it up in his famous known knowns, known unknowns, when he spoke about unknown unknowns. And if you look at the history of those exercises that Ray mentioned, the QDR, the 5-year planning, the POM, all those things that the Pentagon uses to try to envision future challenges, to try to posture our military in ways that will meet those future challenges. As Bob Gates, I think, pretty eloquently put it, when it comes to predicting the future, we've got a perfect record. We've been wrong every time. And it's not because we don't try. I mean, the Pentagon has historically worked at those kinds of things time and time again. It's just those unknown unknowns continuously present themselves. Ray mentioned those things. You know, we didn't see Al-Qaeda and the damage that didn't just start, but certainly was emphasized in 9/11. We didn't see ISIS and their march through wide swaths of land in both Syria and Iraq. We didn't see the fall of the Berlin Wall. If we were seated here 30 years ago to this day, the Berlin Wall would fall on Saturday. We didn't know it. And we didn't know that subsequent to that, the USSR would largely dissolve in the ways in which we knew it. So it just goes to show that if you have to pick a word as to this exercise, it's hard. It's damn hard. There's an old saying that generals are always fighting the last war. And you know what? You look at it, and we've got a raft of military attaches here today. I don't know as that applies to their generals, but it certainly applies to ours. And I think historically it's understandable. First of all, after a pre-war or after a post-war period, at least in American history, what happens to the budgets? They're cut. It happened after World War I, World War II, it happened after Korea, it happened after Vietnam. When Ray and I were in the Pentagon, we were at war, not in one, but 2 theaters, and the budgets were cut. It's hard to try to posture yourselves and procure the platforms that are necessary, whatever your analysis tells you will be the next challenge, the next threat, but you don't have the money to do what you've already been doing. The second thing is, historically, I mean, if you look at last war and then the next war periods, historically, technology didn't change that much. The English longbow was considered disruptive to the military structure because it was a standoff weapon that really hadn't been seen. You know, the rifle barrels for muskets were rifled so that they're more accurate. But by and large, military battles for centuries look pretty much the same as they always did. The trench warfare of World War I will look really familiar to the military commanders in the American Civil War. But with the advent of World War I and then rapidly increasing in World War II, what we saw was technological innovation and development. And I think a lot has been said about the marginal line, and I've kind of spent a little time looking at it. Great debate whether it was effective, whether it was not. But I would argue what the French didn't consider, and frankly most of the West was not aware of either, was the technological advances that the German army was able to bring to the battlefield in the advancement of the Ardennes. They moved artillery, they moved infantry with a rapidity and speed that really had never been seen, at least until that time. And the interesting fact was the vast majority of the German military was relying upon their logistics and their troop movement on horses, because that's pretty much what they had post-World War I. But at the point of attack, they were able to bring what later became the Blitzkrieg, which is generally thought of as kind of an air war concept, to the Ardennes and overwhelm French forces. And that's really where we are today. Those kinds of highly disruptive military technologies, as Ray said, are happening each and every day. And frankly, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which, again, underscoring my friend's comments, is the inability procedurally for the United States to keep up with that. That's certainly where the Pentagon, I think, is today. What are these disruptive technologies? How are they going to be brought to bear? We identified in 2018 what we think the next challenges are going to be. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Kind of different challenge sets, but particularly what we call today near-peer competitors. I could use other phrases. In China and Russia, what do we need to procure and how do we need to embed it into our systems that continues the superiority, technological superiority the United States enjoyed? We haven't had a contested airspace probably since Vietnam. And that was short-lived. We overcame that in pretty good order. That's not going to be the future. That's not going to be the tomorrows. We have to find ways to take these technologies, many of which we know full well about, and embed them in a way that keeps them relevant, as Ray said, because you cannot, in today's world, go out and buy an iPhone in 2018 and expect it to operate the same in 2022. You will have had probably 6 new iPhones in that period. We have to find a way to break through that. All the military services, including the Department of Defense, have established commands to try to figure all of this stuff out, to try to slice across the procurements, kind of silos that have so long, in part, inhibited our acquisition. And the Army, the thing I'm most familiar with, the Army Futures Command, it has been challenged, and I think a big challenge, in trying to figure all of that out. And there's concerns on Capitol Hill about its effectiveness, how is it all going to work, et cetera, et cetera. But for now, the Army Futures Command is focused on 6 emerging challenges in development. Future vertical lift, long-range and precision fires, soldier lethality, the network, air and missile defense, and the next generation combat vehicle. None of those sound particularly disruptive. They don't sound particularly new. We got vertical lift. They're called helicopters. We got a whole lot of them. We've got long-range fires. It's called artillery, and it's called missile. And we've got combat vehicles. So if you look at it from that context, you go, there they go. They're fighting the last war. But coupled with that, as Ray said, they're trying to figure out what are the emerging technologies that can be embedded into those platforms in a way that at least marginally keeps our technological superiority. And no matter where the challenge, threat, opponent arises, we can bring that to bear for successful military command. And these are things that you've all heard about: artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, unmanned systems, reactive armor. These are things that are not particularly revelatory in their context, but how do you embed those in future systems that will provide you with those kinds of advances and those kinds of advantages that have made us most successful? Whether it's all going to work, we'll have to wait and see. Whether we maintain Bob Gates' perfect record, I hope not, but we'll have to wait and see. But those are the kinds of things that we're looking at right now. The last thing I would say, and Ray and I experienced budget agita time and time again in our days in the Pentagon, I would argue one of the most important things we have to have as the United States military, and we've got some industry folks here today, and if they think differently, I'd be both surprised and interested to hear it, is some kind of predictability. We have, sequestration. We have continuing resolutions. We have everything but a regularly occurring budget cycle that allows the United States military to have some reasonable understanding of what their budget will be going forward, of what they can afford and not afford to pursue. Equally important, our industrial partners are absolutely essential to a robust and a successful national defense. They have to have that kind of predictability to know what kinds of people do we have to hire, what kinds of materials, and how much do we have to procure. What can we do to have multi-year acquisitions, something you use pretty well in your acquisition process, saving millions and millions of dollars, but without those, and under a CR, you can't enter those kinds of agreements. So I think Congress, our topic is the Pentagon, but I think Congress has an absolutely essential role in this to somehow, as Ray said, keep the transparency, keep the mechanisms of responsibility and accountability, but allow the United States military to do in some reasonable fashion what a China or a Russia can do today, and that is, I want that, let's get it. And they do that tomorrow. So, kind of a scene setter of sorts.
Well, you both mentioned the Gates, poor record. And, it's easy to be a money-going quarterback. But the fact of the matter is, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Berlin Wall, they weren't like an earthquake that just happened all of a sudden. I mean, there were signs out there. So is that our intelligence community outside the Pentagon? Or what kind of cooperation is there? And what can be done to have those better warning signs?
I think there's great cooperation with Intel and the entire intelligence community. I would argue a little bit that they were sort of like earthquakes, that you saw, there was something out there, but it was incoherent. You couldn't tell what it was you were looking for. And so I think, to go back to what John said and the way you posited this when we started, the thing we can do is to be flexible enough when we do get good intelligence to be able to act on it, to be well trained enough, but without being doctrinaire. The famous Mike Tyson quote, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the face. And the Marines have a thing that they just drill into Marines: innovate, adapt, overcome, because you don't know what you're going to face. And so instead of looking for specific threats, which we've got to do, but the training that we give, the things that we procure, the way that we procure them have to be flexible enough and fast enough that if something that is a complete unknown, a complete surprise comes over the horizon at us, that we're not caught flat-footed, that we can adapt, that we can innovate in the moment, that we can overcome. We're still building, to John's point, fighting the last war, we're still building these huge aircraft carriers. I built 3 of them. I'm certainly not innocent here. But maybe time to take a look at building a lot more, a lot smaller conveyances for unmanned vehicles. Because the F-35 that we're buying today ought to be the last manned fighter that we ever buy. It ought to be the last manned aircraft we ever buy. And so you may not need these huge floating cities that we have. You may not need the size of armies that we have. You're going to need ground troops, the Army and the Marines, but we have to think about them differently and how they're going to be used. So I think that's the connection to Intel, is whatever the intelligence that comes in, and our intel agencies are very good, regardless of what this administration says. They're terrific in terms of getting not only raw intelligence, but analyzed intelligence to the military. But the military has to be nimble enough to act on that intelligence.
John, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would associate myself with Ray's comments about they were earthquake-like. When you talk about Al-Qaeda, you talk about ISIS. And I would argue particularly ISIS. I mean, we knew about Osama bin Laden, but he was pretty much a rogue son of a very wealthy Saudi construction family. We had a chance. He was offered when he was in Africa, but there's a difference between saying, well, he may be a bad guy 10 years from now, so let's take him out, and saying, well, we got to wait for something more actionable than that. I do believe the intelligence committees are doing a great job, always have. The problem in years not so far removed is that there wasn't great integration. And now they've got the Counterterrorism Threat Center and other mechanisms by which all of the intel from across the agencies, military and civilian, the three-letter agencies, come together to try to do the best job they can to analyze, what those threats are. ISIS was a total explosion. I mean, there are from my knowledge, very few indicators of that threat with the swiftness with which they moved, and it was facilitated by a very poor performing, very shaky Iraqi military in the first instance. But it is a matter of the ability to react to the unknown unknowns. I'd like to say that, look, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all these other kind of boom threats are not going to happen in the future. I suspect they're far more likely to happen than not. So if you don't know about these things, if you can't have a reasonable way to find out about them, what do you do? As Ray said, you have the most adaptable, the most reactive possible military posture and structure and strategy that you possibly can, and that takes us back to planning and predicting the future. All the services now, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, are talking about multi-domain operations. For the last 15 plus years, we've been involved in counterterrorism activities almost exclusively. We lost those skills to do other things, and the military, all the services are trying to recapture that. What is recognized today is, unlike in days past, where you may have sea battle and air battle and land battles, or you may have air, sea, land, there are new domains out there that have to be considered and integrated into your war planning and your strategy and your doctrines. And that is cyber, and that is space, and that is real hard. I mean, the Chinese reportedly in open source reporting already have 2 quantum satellites in orbit, which in theory means they're totally unhackable, totally immune from any outside interference. Those are the kinds of things you've got to be able to react to and accommodate for. And that takes us back to Bob Gates, perfect record, we've been wrong. But I do think conceptually the military, the United States military, is doing a far better job to try to envision these things, try to posture their positions in a way that allows them to have the greatest flexibility to react to it. But again, our processes, our bureaucracy, the laws, the regs to procurement are far more restrictive, I think, than can be totally effective and are frankly necessary for the kinds of things we want, transparency and accountability.
Well, speaking of quantum, I'm told that the Chinese are capturing our various messages now that they can't decode, and they're just holding them until their quantum computing, it comes up to speed so that they then can, decode them, although they may be 5 years, 10 years, whatever in the past, but it'll still be information. That's something we're going to deal with. So
I would argue that we ought to send virtually everything out plain language. Because if it confuses our potential adversaries half as much as it confuses us, I mean, I pity the people who have to read those messages 5 years from now and 10 years from now.
Well, the recently departing departing in a sense, leaving here and going back to Europe, ambassador from the EU. So he's a good friend, and we were talking one day, and he said, you know, the relationship is never going to be the same. It'll get better, but it'll never get the same. So, John, as you look past President Trump, whether it's 1 year or 5 years, and you look at the relationship of our military with the rest of the world, what's it going to be like?
Well, we had a phone conversation last week, and I'm going to steal Ray's line and sue me later. But he said, you know, you can buy back capacity and capability, which what you can't buy back is trust. And I do worry about the lack of trust that has occurred amongst our allies, and both existing and potential, and how much they can or cannot rely upon the United States in the future. Here in the United States, we think, well, okay, we get a new president, and a lot of this disassociation, for lack of a better word, that has happened can be rebuilt pretty quickly. I mean, it's foreign policy. The policy of the United States changes, move back. But that trust aspect, I do think is going to take some time. Having said that, there's no other nation on the face of the earth that can provide the kinds of shared values and the kinds of leading values the United States espouses. Most people, and if you look at the protests in Hong Kong or what's been happening across the globe, are not aspiring to the kinds of lives and security and freedom that are provided in places like China, places like Russia. But ideals, as good as they are, have to be backed up by actions. And you know, I think this nation is far better, far stronger, and means more to people across the planet than just one man. No matter, you can debate his efficacy, you can debate his policies, but it is one man, and we've had a lot of one men in the White House. Hopefully someday we'll have a one woman. But those values continue. And the United States military, through some pretty challenging times, I think politically, small p and large p, continue to be the model upon which most other nations want to mold their defense strategies.
Ray, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think John got it exactly right. I think I worry a little bit more than you do about it. I think we are a unique nation, but I'm a little bit concerned about what the former EU ambassador said. And it's because, yes, our policies, we get another president, hopefully our policies go back to working closely with our allies, to representing our values, our beliefs. But if I'm a citizen of another nation, my question is, okay, you elected this guy once. What's going to keep you from doing it again? Or, 4 years from now, or 8 years from now, or whenever? How can we trusted you, and you betrayed that trust? Okay, you've got a better person in now, or a different person in with different values, different policies, much closer to the rest of the world. How do we know you're not going to change again on a dime? And that's my concern. That's the concern that I think you, Ambassador, was talking about.
Well, I'm also concerned about who fills that void during the interim. What are we can call them supply chains or trust chains? How are they, reformed? But let me open things up now. So for anybody else that has, you've got a good chance here to put these guys on the spot. Yes, sir.
Lieutenant Colonel Sedo, Azerbaijan's defense attaché. I actually have two questions. One, as the Naval War College graduate, I would like to ask yes, sir. I remember remember we were doing wargaming and stuff, Navy and Air Force wise, they still got some, let's say, conventional warfare scenarios. But for Army and Marine Corps, the US Armed Forces, they, let's say, 90% they've switched to the unconventional warfare theaters. If we will see the other countries like Russia and China and Iran, for example, they're not fully into unconventional warfare. The Georgian war showed us in 2008, the 2014 Ukrainian theater showed that Russians, they are good after the Chechenian war, which was on their territory, unconventional warfare, and I think that was the only case when the rebel group, let's say former terrorists, they are now fighting for Putin, but they were fighting against him. That was a huge switch actually that we were looking, and how they managed to do that is still, for me, is a question. China-wise, they are not going into unconventional theater at all. They stay fully conventional. We have never seen any Chinese troops deployed in any unconventional warfare theater. Iranians, they do unconventional through Hezbollah and other groups, but they also stay conventional because they think that tomorrow they're gonna get attacked and we have to fight on their soil. How far you think you went from being conventional, or as you mentioned before, that you're focused on artificial intelligence, unconventional warfare, cyber, and other things? What do you think in the future, if there's gonna be any scenario that you will have to back up, let's say any country like Ukraine or Georgia, or even my country, Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh region, how fast will you be able to adapt and, let's say, overcome that difficulty that it's been since 1991 you're not fighting conventionally, and 91 wasn't fully conventional in Iraq, the conflict. And then there is another question, if you want I will ask after.
Yeah.
So you make a good point. The United States has been involved almost exclusively in unconventional counterterrorism activities for over 15 years. That's why, as I mentioned, we're returning to multi-domain and more conventional training. The fact of the matter is, you will always see a Russia. You have questions about what turned in Chechnya. I have fewer questions. I know the power of Putin, the threat of assassination, and what money will buy you. But it won't buy you over longer-term loyalty. We need to have a conventional war capability, and that's what all the services. I can't speak. I won't speak to what you learned in your Navy training, but we recognize that our existential, and I'm talking not just the United States, I'm talking about freedom, democracy, liberty, threat in the near term is clearly coming from China and Russia. And that if we ever get out of the Hezbollah kinds of surrogate wars that we're seeing in the Middle East particularly, but in other places, and it's force on force with Russia and China, it'll largely be conventional. But today's conventional warfare will not be tomorrow's conventional warfare. And that's the object of trying to get back to the process of identifying what technologies we can incorporate into our platforms, into our formations that will allow us to have some sort. It'll certainly not be the kind of technological superiority we've enjoyed for the last 30 years, but some sort of superiority over whether it's Russia, China, or that unknown, that allow victory of sorts. So I do think that we are preparing for the conventional warfare. I do believe our entire planning concepts are largely, not exclusively, but largely based on the likelihood of conventional theaters and countries that are likely to employ conventional tactics such as Russia and China.
The only thing I would add is great answer, is what he said, conventional warfare today doesn't look like conventional warfare tomorrow. The examples you gave, Russia going into Georgia, Russia going into Crimea, both were preceded by cyber attacks. That's become conventional warfare. That's a domain of warfare now. That's not unconventional. That's not, but we did lose the muscle memory. We did lose the ability to do some of these things that weren't counterterror. And all the services are working pretty hard to get that back in various ways. But I think that conventional warfare is going to be redefined through cyber, through space, through the types of weapon systems and things like that we have.
May I add something?
Sure.
And I think it would have been an absolute catastrophic failure, but if you were Russia or China and you wanted to attack the United States at a time when their military was least postured doctrinally to respond to you, it would have been like last year, 2 years ago. And again, I don't think that would be successful, but we were, as Ray said, very, very low on the scale of adequate muscle movement to respond in a conventional field.
Yes, sir.
So Dave Gibbs from New Zealand, you talked about the challenges of your budget process. I didn't even know about the organisation, the spent all its time writing checks. But do you see fundamental structural change within the Pentagon organisation itself as a catalyst for actually making the types of changes you need to do to get the business actually within the building working more effectively, or can it occur through gradual evolution?
I think that's going to be one of the toughest things that you do, because the bureaucracy digs in more than almost anything else, and it's the biggest bureaucracy we got in government. And people protect their own fiefdoms and domains.
So a supplementary question then, what could be done based on the experience the two of you have had?
Well, I think you're going to have a couple of champions. I think you're going to have to, and you're going to have some necessity. You need a champion probably as president, you need a champion as Secretary of Defense to do some of these things. You need a champion in Congress to make sure that they go along with it, or that they provide the funds in a way that you can do it. The necessity is going to come from, I think virtually every candidate running in the Democratic primaries says one of the things they're going to do is cut defense. And the necessity came through some of the stuff that John talked about, sequestration. And what you don't want to do during those times is you don't want to just take a percentage, just take 10% out of everything, which is what sequestration did, without regard. What you do want to do is use that budget drill as a way to rethink your priorities. Okay, what's the highest priority for us? What must we save the money for? So, must we save the money for R&D? Must we save the money to make sure that we never go into a fair fight technologically? What's our top priority? And then, much lower down the chain, what's our lowest priority? And what can we do without? What do we need to cut? And I think that if you have those champions, if you have that necessity, and you think through it clearly and well, and Congress is going to be a tough nut to crack there, because every district has got aces, and every state does. And I was a governor. I commanded the National Guard. I really liked the National Guard when I was governor. And I thought it needed to be given a lot more stuff and money. One of the things I was most thankful about when I got to the Pentagon was the Founding Fathers never gave a National Guard to the Navy or the Marines.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
how you see depends on where you sit. But an example of that is in Iowa. The Air Force tried to take F-16s away from the Iowa National Guard. And the governor of Iowa fought it, saying we need it for flood control. Really? And got to keep them. Got to keep the F-16s. Now, Iowa may not need F-16s. They may need more Army National Guard or a different kind of structure. But I think that I think the fight will come down to the appropriations process and the congressional process. I think the Pentagon probably has the capability to think through it and to come up with a pretty good plan. But whether they can get it through Congress and whether it can be funded, I think is
Back
Whoa,
row.
whoa, whoa, whoa.
Oh, you.
Well, first of all, what I'm not going to talk about is the National Guard, because every time I took them on, I got my ass beat. They are, as Ray said, very potent politically, but to Ray's point, there's a myriad of problems here. First of all, how many budget exercises did Bob Gates put us through? I mean, it used to be you'd do 5-year reviews every 5 years. We were doing them every year, and then you had the regular budget process, blah, blah, blah. We were given target for cuts, et cetera, et cetera. This is precinct sequestration. And I may be wrong here, but I can't recall through any of those exercises where all the services, including Ray's Navy and my Army, cut, and the Fourth Estate cut nothing. And if anything, they built it up to somehow supplant the losses that the military services take. There is too much double dribbling, to use an American metaphor, between the services and the Department of Defense and their bureaucratic structure. That's not to say for purposes of coordination and integration that DOD and their staff are unnecessary, but they are way beyond what I would argue are the necessary limits, and that just slows things down, and the repetitive nature of the reviews and the checks and balances are beyond reasonable in my judgment. I think the biggest hurdle, though, I used to be the city manager, and just for the hell of it, one year I decided, well, let's look at the municipal code. Well, we had laws against, feeding your horse on Main Street between the hours of 12 and 3, and just things that were added. Sure. Well, yeah, you don't want to do that. That angers people. But point being, we had layer upon layer of rules and regulations and laws and can't-dos and that were absolutely totally outdated, were at best duplicative, were in fact often in conflict. And I would argue our procurement laws are much like that. You've got regulations that are on and on and on, implemented one year after another. You've got laws that require this, require that. And so Ray's point, and you do need champions across. I think, Bob Gates did a great job with his procurement challenges and brought some platforms on board more quickly. I think the services have tried within the allowable space they've been given to accelerate their procurement processes. But unless and until a champion or two, and I'll give Mac Thornberry and Adam Smith credit because they tried to begin the process of reforming the procurement requirements, but there is a long way to go. There's just too many hurdles to go through, often duplicative, often, I'll be duplicative here and say often repetitive, and often outdated and unnecessary, but they are law or they are regulations, so they have to be followed. And a program that should take at most 2 years takes 7 or 10.
Okay, new rules, new rules. We're going to have more questions and less answers. And so let's go to the back and your question. And we'll have one answer, one crisp answer.
Either of you can answer this. I'm Sissy Jackson. I work with Senator Jones from Alabama. You've talked about the need for streamlining, let's say, in the administrative part of the Pentagon, as well as perhaps among the programs. And we've heard about Secretary Esper's night court when he was Army Secretary. It's my understanding that that was mostly about cutting programs, trying to align things better with the National Defense Strategy and the Army's modernization priorities. But he says he's doing it across the Pentagon. I don't know how much you know about how that process is going or what your thoughts are on whether that's the way to go about doing what you all think needs to be done and whether it's got a chance.
I don't know what he's doing, so.
Let's hope he does. I'll try to be crisp. So I had a chance to go to the Pentagon 2 weeks ago and talk to the Director of Army Staff, and of course he's key in the night court thing. I don't know what time they held it, I suspect at night, but it honestly is another name for processes that have been embedded for some time now to make hard decisions and difficult budget challenges. The fact that Secretary Esper is trying to institutionalize that, I think it has value. What I fear, it goes back to what I said earlier, somehow I just know at the end of the day, and I know this is not Mark's fault, it seems to be a natural process. When it all gets said and done, the OSD staff's going to be even bigger. It just seems to happen that way. But anything you can do to control and to institutionalize meaningful, helpful processes that lead you to a better place, I think is worth pursuing. And I'm sure that, I know Mark Esper. He's a great American, great guy with a big job, big challenge, tough times. And I wish him well. We'll have to wait and see if it actually works.
Any other questions? Yes.
So, Sam Fletcher with Senate Quality, sitting back here next to a couple other Senate staffers. The threat of congressional reform has come up a couple times. 2 former members of Congress up there. All 3 of you have a wealth of experience budgeting, getting budgets passed. There was a joint congressional committee last year that looked at sort of the budget appropriations reform question. They came up with some solutions. Looks like none of that's going to go anywhere. I'm just curious, y'all's take on easy to identify the problems in that whole area, but what would your solutions be if you were sort of king for a day to fix the budget and appropriations project?
Get it passed on time. I think multi-year budgets would be wonderful. I mean, that's a real challenge procedurally and legally, et cetera, but I would defer to our industry reps. If you take a congressional budget, or no, just the United States military's budget, DOD's budget, right now they're planning for about 2021 at the staff level. That'll go through, and as you know, the military services come up with something, they send it to OSD, the SecDef, DepSecDef, CAPE, and others, and we love CAPE. That's another story. It goes through it, send it back for alibis and for responses and services, then send it to OMB. OMB imprints it, sends it back to DOD. DOD sends it back to OMB. OMB sends it to the President. President sends it to Capitol Hill. You all know this as well, if not better than I do. By the time that damn budget gets passed and on, you got an almost 2-year-old budget. There has to be a way that embodies the kind of responsibility and the accountability that process is intended to provide, and doesn't take so damn long. Think of the things we didn't know about 2 years ago. And you know this, again, it's not going to work, particularly and most importantly in an environment when I'll go back to China and Russia. They don't operate that way. If Putin says tomorrow, I want the military budget to do this A, B, C, D, it's enacted in place, at most a month later. I'm not saying they do it quite that way, but we've got to find a more accelerated way. And if we are going to take that amount of time, okay, my opinion, John McHugh, worth absolutely nothing, exactly what you paid to get in here tonight. It ought to provide for a 2, 3, 4-year budget cycle, so that there's predictability and you can catch up to that approval process that puts you 2 years behind the beginning, in my opinion.
Yes, sir.
Frank from Germany. My question is if the challenge of cyber threats is too big for the Pentagon on its own. Let me tell you the German example. We have been amazingly fast in creating an own force which is responsible for cyber defense, but we only allowed to protect our military systems. And there are attacks on German industry, there are attacks on energy suppliers, but we are not allowed to do anything. And we are not allowed to start any attacks, even if we can locate the computer system wherever it is coming from, because we don't know, for example, is that not the Russian government, or is it any terrorist attack, or is it maybe just a freak which is starting this attack? So my question is there, or do we need a whole government approach to react against cyber, because this is a daily threat and not only the military is responsible?
Well, short answer, yes, we do. I think we're pretty far down the road in that. Militarily, yes, but the head of NSA, that's head of cyber for the whole government, is also head of cyber command for the military. He has that dual job. And it's something that we have had to learn very quickly. I went to a war game my first year as secretary. A little ways in, I was just watching. The person running the war game said, "You just lost all your communications. Satellites are down, your weapons are down, everything." And the game just sort of ended because nobody knew what to do. That wouldn't happen today. We've stood up Cyber Command. We've stood up 10th Fleet in the Navy, which is our cyber component. And the authorities have begun to catch up. We can do offensive actions now. We can do defensive actions now. I mean, when the Iranians seized a tanker, our response was a cyber attack, not a conventional attack. I think and attribution is hard, but not impossible. And I think you can, and you've seen that governments work with criminal organizations. Governments work with hackers outside the organization, but you can, given the expertise, which I think we're pretty good at now, you can have the accountability. I think the question we haven't answered yet, except in extreme circumstances, is when does a cyber attack equal an act of war? When can you do a kinetic response, or in Marine terms, put a warhead on forehead for a cyber attack? And unless people die due to the cyber attack, we haven't answered that. And the one we really haven't answered is if you have cyber attack after cyber attack after cyber attack from the same source, each one by itself not significant, but multiplied by 8 million times a day, by years, and the cumulative damage that's being done, when can you then have a kinetic response? When can you respond outside the cyber realm? And we haven't answered that yet.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir, for your excellent and I think honest discussions. I'm Colonel Petteri Seppälä from the Finnish Embassy. I studied 5 years ago at the War College, and we and my classmates from the other foreign nations, we visited some of your states. And I still remember like yesterday when we saw one of the governors, and he was former congressman, and he told us that he left the federal level policies because he didn't any ways to cooperate with his colleagues from the other party. So he was really worried about the polarization, and it was 5 years ago. And I think the thing has not improved from those days. So do you think there still is a spirit in Pentagon to be able to do the good for the country, not just good for the individuals or good for your party? NDAA is stuck at the moment, as you know. And do you still know, if you are worried what should be done, that there would be more unified way to work for the country?
So I
John,
think
would you take that?
that's a real concern. When I was in Congress when the impeachment of Bill Clinton occurred, and I woke up every day saying, boy, it can't get worse than this. And guess what? It has gotten worse almost every day since then. And what really troubles me in those days is, as many of you may recall, we had our political differences and our political fights. But it's still at the end of the day where it mattered, such as national defense. We found a way to govern. That seems to be slipping away. But to your point about the Pentagon, I still believe very, very strongly that in the Pentagon, and Ray and I were there longer than I was there for over 6 years, you really got a sense of politics stopped at the doorways, stopped probably at the Beltway, and the mission was what drove everybody. And if you need a sign of that, when a former military officer comes out today and makes a political statement, that gets headlines, and it gets headlines because it's so unusual. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that ethos of generals, men and women in uniform, the civilians of the Pentagon, don't get involved in politics. We're above it, we're apart from it, as the case may be, I think is still an overriding sentiment. And it starts in the Pentagon and with the Secretary of Defense. And knowing Mark Esper as I do, I guarantee you, he's just military focused. Right? I don't know.
Well, we've got time for just a couple more questions. Yes. Let me ask, does anybody have a new question? Anybody that hasn't asked one? Ask one? Yeah, let's go here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. You have been very tough on your procurement program. Try the foreign ones. Try the foreign ones and you will realize you can be actually fairly happy with yours. But something that to an outside observer who has been in security policy for a long time, something that's much more worrying whether to know whether you will have just the up-to-date weapon system is the lack in expertise in security policy. I remember the times past when we were dealing with administrations that were full of people who had been through the Atlanticist kind of school of thought for security in the world, people who would know when the utility of force, to paraphrase a British general, was really the order of the day. When would you use force, when wouldn't you? And nowadays we get the feeling that this knowledge has largely been lost. And you find it in think tanks, but not in the administration anymore. Because all the people who knew how it works are gone. And that's something that to outside observers who have always had to rely on a predictability of American security policy is much more worrying than whether the latest weapon system would be procured 1 or 2 years later. And I would like to have your reaction on this.
Well, I think you're right in terms of the worry. I think there is expertise. I think to one of your points, there's expertise outside in the think tanks and the things that people who have been through these bureaucratic battles and political fights go to these think tanks. places like the Pentagon rely on these think tanks a lot in terms of policy, in terms of taking looks at policies and deep dives when we don't have the expertise internally. I think that the second part, though, I had exactly the same experience John did, that politics tend to end at the doorway to the Pentagon. It should, and particularly for people in uniform, it's just drilled in from the day they put on the uniform. They are apolitical. It doesn't matter what party, it matters who the chain of command is, and they shouldn't worry about who's at the top or who's in power. And that also goes, as John said, to the civilians inside the Pentagon, some of whom were involved in the policy. One of the troubling things that I saw and I was there for 8 years, was the politicalization of our jobs, of the policy jobs of the civilians inside the Pentagon. And you saw it during hearings in Congress. You saw it in criticisms of the Pentagon and the people in it. Not so much people in uniform, but the civilians that were doing the policy. And I think that has a really corrosive impact. I mean, we've got a staffer for Senator Collins. When I was the nominee, Mississippi, where I was governor, has a big shipyard. Maine has a big shipyard. They make the same kind of ships. One of the things she asked me, she said, "Are you going to favor Mississippi?" And I said, "I've been nominated to be the United States Secretary of the Navy, not the Mississippi Secretary of the Navy. I'm going to do what's best for the United States Navy, not what's best for any given state." And I really think that political appointees in these jobs, in these military jobs, in these national security jobs, ought to approach them that way, and ought to be given the benefit of the doubt that they are approaching them that way. Now, if they don't, I think action should be taken. That it's very dangerous to have these jobs politicized. Because it's one of the things that really does set us apart as a nation, the absolute civilian control of the military and the absolute control of the civilian side, whether congressional or executive branch. And that's something that I think has been eroded pretty significantly, and it's dangerous. And we need to reverse it if we can.
We're going to have to wind up soon, so are there any other first-time questioners? And a quick last question, and then we'll have a
Yes,
close.
and that's one that follows up in the first question I've asked. It's the second one I wanted to ask. It's about as you said, the last war is fought by generals, and about the force projection in the theaters of operations we've seen the last years. The difference, what do you think is the reason why U.S. before doing the force projection is thinking, let's say, more than twice, but because of the autocratic system of Russia and a little bit aggressive foreign policy maybe of Putin, that in our region, for example, Southeast Europe and East Europeans, we are concerned mostly about Russia is not thinking twice before getting involved in any conflict. Like example of, again, Georgia and Ukraine. They had to face them because they wanted to join NATO, they wanted to join the European Union, they wanted to stay on the democratic path of there, and they had to face the concern. On the other side, we've seen the Venezuela since like 6 months ago. They had a full backup by Russian troops, and the Cubans even got involved with the Russian help and stuff. but none of the U.S., let's say, boots on the ground or troops or somehow the undercover special operations units were being sent there. What is the reason, or what do you think the main reason why you are not getting involved in those areas of operation, and you are not backing up those countries maybe that they want to join your path, your way of democracy?
Well, I would argue, and I take your point, it's not exactly as though we're uninvolved in either Georgia or Ukraine. It took us too long, in my judgment, just a personal opinion, to provide so-called lethal aid to the Ukrainians, and I think we could do a lot more. We continue to provide support to Georgia, and you look at the European Security Initiative with our forward rotational forces in Poland, into Romania, and other countries. It's intended to show the Russians we're here, and you better not do that again. Look, the Russians have a strategy. You talk about predicting the future. They go into Georgia, they take Abkhazia, yeah. And then how many years later they do a similar action in Crimea, and then start their little green men activity in eastern Ukraine.
They actually did it in my country in 91.
Yeah. Well, that's their pattern.
Yeah.
Right after they went into Ukraine, my dear friend President Obama sent me, well, actually, I guess it was the Secretary of Defense, sent me to Georgia, Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and my job was to say the United States stands behind its NATO commitments, and we're going to do everything that is necessary to protect ourselves. But how long until the Russians do the next kind of thing? I mean, it's a repetitive action, and when I was in those European countries, frankly, the military and civilian leaders said, "Why are you surprised? We told you this is going to happen, and it will happen again," and I believe that. We're trying to do two things at once. We're trying to commit ourselves to a very real threat in rebalancing in the Pacific, given China, but we're also recognizing, unlike what we thought after the fall of the Berlin Wall 30 years ago next Saturday, the dissolution largely of the USSR, we could just walk away from Europe, or largely walk away. We can't do that. So we're trying to reconstitute ourselves. The decisions that you mentioned weren't military decisions, not to give lethal aid, not to go here, not to put boots on the ground. Those are political decisions. And that wasn't just this president or President Obama, it was a series of presidents. You can certainly argue that wasn't the best message to send to the Russians. But we'll either have 4 more years of this leader, or 4 years of a new leader next election next year. We'll see where that takes us. But from a military perspective, through the programs that have been authorized, again, the European Security Initiative and others, we've been trying to posture ourselves as effectively as we can.
This has been a relatively dire conversation, and I guess when you talk about war, it should be sort of that way. So let's just conclude by Ray and then John. What was the most satisfying thing that you did during your term?
Don't say beat Army.
It was easily the people.
Yeah, seeing that.
John McHugh, I mean, a Republican congressman and a Democratic governor, became good friends. Getting to deal with sailors and Marines every single day. And if you worry about the future of this country, if you worry about generations that are following us, just spend a little time with the 18, 19, 20-year-old soldiers, sailors, Marine, airmen. You won't be worried anymore. The patriotism, the willingness to sacrifice, and the privilege that it was to get to lead those women and men. That was easy.
beside that, John.
Oh, no, you can't go beside it. I used to say, you know, what an honor it is to go to work in the building every day when the word hero really means something. And it really, really does. And let me add, you know, I went to Iraq, and I don't, he's the traveling secretary, but I went to Iraq and Afghanistan and other theaters 26 times, and I see these gentlemen here, military attachés. It was rare I went to any of those places and didn't see our allies, our friends, that are absolutely essential to the future. I won't name him, but there was a congressman once who said the only reason somebody goes in the United States military is because they can't get a job. These young men and women are absolutely stunning. The technical capabilities that they put, the bravery that they show. I mean, you can't have a bigger honor than that. Other than that, my biggest thrill was taking Ray Mabus out to dinner after every game his damn made.
Well, thank you all for coming. This was, I think I'm a little more informed. I hope you are.